Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with my first video of 2024, and I'm going to kick things off on the channel this year by taking a look at my top 10 picks for books in my collection which I consider to be one and done reads for the most part, meaning that there's no real prior reading that you have to get through in order to enjoy these books, and there's not really anything you'd have to read specifically afterwards to get the rest of the story. I'm going to be looking at these in no particular order. So there's not exactly a ranking, it's just a list, and each of these books I have done an individual review on, so I'm not going to spend too much time delving into each one. But I'm going to start things off by looking at this one here. This is, of course, The Daredevil by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson Omnibus. This is not the most recent printing of this book. I've had this a few years now. It was reprinted again not too long ago now. But this is just, for me, such a definitive run and take on this character in this series. Obviously, it was part of an ongoing series, so there are issues of Daredevil that came before this, of course, and the series continued after Frank Miller concluded his run. And in fact, he would return and do more Daredevil work later on as well, and that is collected in a second companion omnibus. But this is the full original run by Frank Miller, and this is the one that really you can trace everything back to if you want to look at how modern Daredevil came about and all the elements of the series and the character that are pretty much so popular and which have been so successful ever since. Kind of all stems back to what Frank Miller did on this book during the run collected in this omnibus. So, as I say, it's not something I'm going to dive into in too much detail. I have reviewed this book before. I've talked about it a couple of times, I think, in different videos. But this is a really, really strong set of issues featuring Daredevil. For many people, myself included, I think it's my favourite run on this character. So many cool elements, as I said, of what makes Daredevil so great all comes back to this run. Just going to keep repeating myself and saying that because that's the key thing I can really say about this. You can't really understate how influential Frank Miller was on Daredevil. He really did an absolutely great job on this book, and it's one of the all-time great runs, quite frankly. And having it all in the omnibus here, the full original run, got to make it a top pick. All right, moving on. We're going to be looking at another great book. I mean, all these books are great in my opinion, that's why they're on the list. But this is the SpiderMan 2099 Omnibus Volume 1. Now, this came out last year. It was actually one of my favourite omnibuses of last year. It was a real highlight. This is written by Peter David, almost entirely by Peter David. And it is a Volume 1, and there is a Volume 2 coming. So you might be wondering, why have I picked this as a standalone book? Well, that's because this contains the entire original series from the 90s of Spider-Man 2099. So you're getting that whole run in this book. And what Volume 2 will collect, for those who aren't sure, is actually going to be material featuring Miguel O'Hara that came out years after this. So series that came probably about 15 years later, roughly off the top of my head. And to be honest, I don't think the stuff that's going to be in that second volume is as good. And I'm on the fence at the moment about whether I'm even going to pick that one up, to be honest. Because for me, Spider-Man 2099, it's all about what's in here. I really, really liked this. Such a well-written run. Peter David, a great writer. His run on Hulk is one of my all-time favourite comic runs. I talk about that any chance I can get. And a lot of what he did on the Hulk that made that so good is putting a lot of that same kind of stuff to use in here as well. Just doing some great character work. Putting in some really kind of, in my opinion, fun humour. I really like his sense of humour. Genuinely makes me laugh at times. And just giving it quite, a gripping feel. I got really immersed into this story as I got through it, and the further I went through, was starting to get really invested in these characters and where it was all going to end up. So, yeah, all in all, got to recommend this one because, as I say, it is the full original run. It's a really big omnibus. And prior to this omnibus coming out, I don't think this entire series had actually been collected in collected editions before, so it was a big deal for fans of the series. Keeping things moving, we're going to look at the Aquaman by Jeff Johns omnibus. This was New 52 era stuff. DC's New 52, not for everybody, I know, but I really liked it for the most part, and there were some real highlights in there, and this is really close to being the best of it all, I think. This is a really strong read. I think when I reviewed this individually, I probably mentioned, and if I did, I should have mentioned, that this is one of those books where if you've never read Aquaman before, this is perfect for you, and it's the kind of thing that will show you that this character is actually pretty good when written well. And this is just a pretty short run. It's only 20-something issues, not the biggest omnibus out there, but you get a great combination of good writing by Jeff Johns, who's just always been a very consistent writer, I think, and some great artwork in here as well by Ivan Reis and Paul Pelletier. Just a couple of really solid artists doing great work on here. Overall, a really good book, and far better than the Aquaman movies that have come out from DC over the last few years. So this is kind of all the Aquaman stuff I've read, I don't think I've ever read anything that's surpassed this in terms of just having a fun time reading some Aquaman comics. Gotta recommend that one. Let's move on again, go back to Marvel here. One of my absolute favourite runs. You've got the entire Thor by Walter Simonson run collected in this omnibus. And I think this is getting a reprint this year, actually, I believe. So anybody interested in this, it's going to be a good time for you, because you'll soon have another opportunity to pick it up if you haven't had it before. Slightly controversial thing about this omnibus is that it is recoloured, so it is modern, or more modern recolouring. It's not the original colours as they looked in the comics when they first came out. For a lot of people I know, that's a real deal breaker and they just hate it. I actually really like it. It might be because this was the first way that I read this series, so this omnibus was my first exposure to it all, so for me it doesn't really look weird, and I just think the colours do suit everything really well. I think they did a good job, and if I remember rightly, I think Walter Simonson himself did give it the thumbs up and say he endorsed it, so he was happy with it. But anyway, all that aside, it is just a really good Thor run. It was like the first really epic Thor run as well. So in the 80s, Marvel just were kind of having hit after hit. You had Frank Miller on Daredevil, Simonson on Thor, Roger Stern on SpiderMan, John Byrne on Fantastic Four. Obviously, Chris Claremont's X-Men was ongoing through that decade. So many great quality comics from that decade from Marvel. But for just having all of this in the one book for the purposes of this video, had to choose this because it's one of those runs where you don't need to really know anything about Thor going in. You'll learn everything you need to know as a result of reading this. And at the end of it, Simonson does that thing that I love it when people have been working on the series for a long time get to do, and he gets to have a kind of farewell issue, and it does feel like a proper ending of a story. And obviously Thor comics continued onwards following on from this, but if you never read anything beyond the end of this run, it kind of does feel like you've read the actual ending of a story, so that's really cool. Moving on again then, let's take a look at the Miracle Man Omnibus. So a book that, again, was a pretty big deal when this came out, because this is one of those things that has been quite inconsistent in how it's been collected over the years. I did a review on this just over a year ago now, when I first read it, when I first got the omnibus. Really kind of mature content in here, so that's something to be aware of. But this is Alan Moore and doing kind of what he does best, kind of deconstructing the whole superhero mythos and the concept of superheroes, and kind of asking that question of what if a superpowered being existed in a more realistic world, and what might that actually be like outside of comic books, and really some interesting ideas presented in here. I still feel this way. When I read this, it's kind of split into 3 chapters, 3 books, 3 parts, however you want to best say it. I really liked the first 2. I like what was going on in those, and then it got a lot stranger in the 3rd part. And I am yet to actually get to doing a proper reread of it, to be fair. So could be that my opinion does change next time I go through that. But it starts to get a little bit strange. You see stuff like this, and the narrative style changes quite a lot. It gets quite esoteric and philosophical and strange. But, overall it was a good story, and you're getting it all in here. So for anybody who is interested in Miracle Man, this is such a great way to have it. So yeah, got to go on the list. And moving on, let's take a look at one of the most fun books in my collection. This is just really amusing. It's a great entertaining read. This is the sensational SheHulk by John Byrne Omnibus. And it is Byrne's entire run on SheHulk. Bit of confusion was caused by this when it first came out, because it collects issues 1 to 8 and then jumps forward to issues 31 to 46 and 48 to 50. So it does look like you're missing a big chunk of issues, and technically you are. But the way that Byrne wrote this series was that after he left after the first 8 issues, what he then did was came back with that 31st issue and basically just didn't acknowledge anything that happened in between. It was quite funny how he did it, to be honest. He just continued with that issue as though it was issue 9 and picked his story right up from where he left off. Really just a fun read, you probably already know a little bit about this. It's kind of the first series that was all about breaking the fourth wall and being kind of more of a pure comedy kind of book. Before Deadpool even, not Daredevil, Deadpool was the character everyone thought of who did that. John Byrne was doing it really well here with SheHulk. And there's some really fun stories in here. You know, it's a book that absolutely does not take itself too seriously. It's a very light-hearted read, and that is obviously on purpose. So if you're looking for something that is light-hearted, that is not a heavy read whatsoever, highly recommend you check this book out at some point. I think it's probably out of print now, but you'll obviously be able to read it in other ways, digitally if nothing else, and I would assume at some point it will get a reprint. Really cool artwork in here though as well, kind of John Byrne kind of doing some really nice work overall. He's both a writer and artist for basically all of this. Clearly has quite a good affinity for this character. It seems clear to me that he had a fun time writing this and working on this book. And yeah, it's just something I can always return to, and I know I'm going to have a fun time reading it every time. And to have his full run in the one book obviously makes it a good addition to this list. So next up, we've just taken a look at the SheHulk, but let's go back to her cousin and look at the Immortal Hulk Omnibus, another great omnibus that came out in 2023. There were some really great examples of books that came out last year. And this is the entire Immortal Hulk run, and it is a massive book. You know, it's just huge. It's got the full 50 issues of that series, all the relevant kind of tie-in stuff, the side material stuff. And yeah, so this is one of those books where, to be honest, I was a little on the fence whether I would include it in this video, because technically you can jump right in and start reading this, and I think some people probably will have done that. And it will, you know, you'll be given all the background on the Hulk and Bruce Banner and everything as you go, so you won't be lost, I don't think. But with this one, I do believe that you get more out of it if you've done quite a bit of reading on different Hulk runs that took place before it. Probably in particular Peter David's run. Quite a lot of references to stuff he does in there. So whilst it's not necessary reading, and I feel I can put it on this list, I would stress with this one, probably more than anything else I'm going to mention in this video, that you probably do get more enjoyment out of this, and you know, you'll recognise more references and stuff like that if you have read other Hulk stuff beforehand. But you don't need to read anything beyond this, because the way that this ends, it is the ending to the story. I have not really read much of the run that came after this. I think that's the Donny Cates run, if I'm right about that. And you know, I read the first few issues of that, and it felt like a completely different thing to what was going on in here. So when this book ends, you very much have read the end of the story, and it is a pretty epic story. You know, I've shown this book off a couple of times now. I've done a full individual review on it. I have covered it in some other top list I've done before. It seems to keep coming up, but I like the Immortal Hulk, and I like that it's in this omnibus, so it all goes on. You know, it applies here, it goes on the list. Next up, another release from last year. So these keep coming up, these recent releases, but this was the Batman Adventures Omnibus. So this is the series that is done in the style of the animated series from the 90s. So it's all drawn to look like the way everybody looks in that show. And yeah, I had a kind of surprising time reading this, because I didn't really know anything about it, and then the omnibus came out and I was intrigued, picked the book up, read through it, and yeah, again, you know, I've reviewed it before, so echoing what I said in that review, this is a very episodic book. For the most part, every single issue in here is just a single story. Not a lot of kind of ongoing continuity between issues. For the most part, one individual issue tells a full story, which is really kind of nice if you just want to take a break from kind of longer runs you've been reading. This is also a very easy read, nothing too complicated or, you know, hard to understand going on in here by any means. It's one of those books that's kind of written with both younger and older audiences in mind. It's kind of accessible to both. So not the most mature Batman story stuff, you know, not the most graphic or any of that kind of thing. But, you know, it's really fun. And if you're a fan of that animated series, that show as I was, then you'll probably find things to enjoy in here. It was very nostalgic for me as somebody who watched that show back in the day. It was really nice. And for this cover alone and the spine, which has that same design on it, I just absolutely love the way this book looks. And on the shelf, it looks amazing with the spine showing there. So yeah, really, really good. Let's have a look. Another DC book and another Batman-related book, but not a Batman book as such. This is the Gotham Central Omnibus. And yeah, this is... I know this is a book that a lot of people really, really like, and I maybe don't like it as much as some people do. It's not one of my very favourite books, but it is definitely a good quality story. And, you know, it's all in this one omnibus. So This is not really a Batman book. You know, it focuses more on the major crimes unit of the GCPD, and you're just kind of following various detectives in that department and seeing them working on the cases that they work on. So it's kind of more like done in more of a crime show kind of thing, where Batman pops in now and then because it is in Gotham City, so, you know, you expect him to be around. But he's never really the central focus. And interestingly, you get a lot of different views from these cops on attitudes towards Batman. Some people think he is good and helpful. Other members of the team think he's more of a hindrance. They don't like him. They don't like having a vigilante basically doing their job. But you get to see a lot of what, you know, the different rogues gallery of Batman, people like the Joker and the Scarecrow and Mr. Freeze, what it would be like for just regular people to take them on. Because, you know, obviously we're used to seeing Batman and the Bat family, you know, all being highly trained and capable of fighting them all. But when just regular cops or civilians get caught in, you know, in the battle, then it's obviously a different story. And this is pretty dark stuff in here, pretty disturbing, depressing at times. Definitely not a feel-good book. So if you do want to read something positive, cheer you up maybe, this is not the one I'd recommend. But if you're in the mood for it, this kind of gritty, grim storytelling, it is a good story. And yeah, just a great omnibus to have it all in for that reason. And lastly then, I have neither DC or Marvel, technically not even called an omnibus, but this is Big Damn Sin City, and just lugging it across the table there. This is an absolutely massive book. It's bigger than an omnibus of, you know, from Marvel or DC. It's bigger dimensions than that. Recently, actually, Dark Horse released the monster-sized Hellboy, which is the same kind of scale as this. They've also done, the Colossal Conan in the past as well. So sometimes they just do these really thick, massive books, but I've had this for a long time. It remains one of my favourite books. This is the entirety of Frank Miller's Sin City collected in here. Very mature content, you know, absolutely something to be aware of. But this is just excellent. The writing, the artwork, it's so kind of stylistic. I love it. For me, this is Frank Miller at his very best. You know, as much as I love his Daredevil work and other stuff he's done as well, you know, some of his Batman work, I honestly think that the majority of the stuff in here is the best stuff he's ever done. And this is, I think, a really great way to collect this book. You know, they have been collected in other formats, plenty of other formats over the years. I think not too long ago, each individual story was being collected in a deluxe format, kind of slipcase hardcover. They looked really cool, to be fair. If anybody got those, actually let me know what they're like. But I've always been happy to just have it all in this massive book here. Really, really good binding on this. You know, I've had this book for, I want to say 8 years now, maybe even closer to 9 years since I picked this up. And I've never had a single issue with the binding. Everything is still perfectly in place. So if you're worried about what a massive book like this, you know, how it holds up years later, will it fall apart because of the sheer weight of it? Well, from my experience with this copy at least, not even slightly. Absolutely top tier binding on this book by Dark Horse. And, you know, just bringing it back to the actual content again. I really love everything in here. Really, really great stuff. So that is my main 10 that I've looked at. I want to do a couple of honourable mentions because as I was looking through my collection to try and pick out things for this video, I did think of a couple of others I could have picked. One of those being this one here. So this was Jessica Jones, the Alias Omnibus. Second printing of this came out a while ago now. But this is the full original Alias story. So it was the introduction to Jessica Jones by Brian Michael Bendis and Michael Gaydos. And this is a little bit like the Gotham Central book, actually, in terms of the tone of it, the style of it. It's quite a lot like that. Not a lot of superhero kind of goings-on in here. Much more grounded story. Jessica Jones, being a private investigator, gets drawn into some pretty dark cases in the Marvel Universe. We see a side of the Marvel Universe in here that you don't typically see in the main comic series of different characters. Because this was part of the Max series of comics, which was like a sort of black label line sort of thing that DC do now, in terms of it being more mature content. So yeah, there's a lot more swearing in here, a lot more disturbing stuff, but really good. You know, it's all collected in the one omnibus in here, really nice. And it was a book that, you know, I just really quite enjoyed. You know, I quite liked seeing the character work that Bendis does with Jessica throughout here. She's got plenty of issues to deal with, and we do see how she comes to terms with a lot of her personal issues. Yeah, a really good book, got to say. And lastly then, one more honourable mention, and that is the Death and Return of Superman Omnibus. And this is, you know, one of those kind of monumental comic events, one of the most famous things that's ever come out of comics, to be honest, from the 90s here, when DC decided to kill Superman. And it was obviously a big deal at the time. And this is the whole thing. So it's the, you know, the original lead up to it, then Superman's actual death and the huge fight against Doomsday, then the large chunk of time that he spends being quote-unquote dead, and we see how everybody's dealing with, you know, his absence and the world without Superman. And then the eventual return, you know, as you skip ahead and you see these other wannabe Supermen turning up, like the Cyborg Superman and all the others. And then obviously eventually the triumphant return when the guy himself comes back, and he's wearing that kind of black suit, he's got the mullet, wielding like massive guns. It's one of the most 90s things of all time. A very 90s comic and event all in all. This is it. This is Superman's return with those massive guns. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's something I recommend everybody kind of read through at some point because of its status, one of those iconic stories. And I do really like the design of this omnibus, got to say. But that's going to do it for that one then. Let me know what you think about any of these books that I've covered in here. Anything else you might have added, I'd be interested as well to see what other omnibuses people might include on their own lists. But thank you as always for watching. That's appreciated as always. I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.